we have been walking through the life of David. And as we've been doing that, we've been considering the spiritual giants that David faced. I had someone comment last week, they said, man, we've been in the study of David for a long time. And we have, because there's a lot there. We're going to be in the study for just a few more weeks. We actually have 3 more giants after this one to consider. And then we will be through the study of David. But we've been looking at these giants, and we recognize that there were many of these giants that David faced and dealt with quite easily. But the giant that we're going to consider today, the spiritual giant we're going to consider today, is the one that was probably one of the most powerful giants in David's life. And as we walk through today's story, we're going to see the process that led to this giant almost defeating David. This is the giant that almost got him. This is the big one for David. This is the giant that almost killed him spiritually. And it is the giant that, if we're not careful, for many of us can be the big one for us as well. It's a giant that we don't talk about, I think, nearly enough. And yet it's a giant that so many of us face. You know, a lot of us can relate to this giant because the giant of fleshly desire is one that we all have dealt with to some degree or another. And for some of us, it can become a huge and even overwhelming giant in our lives. And so the question we want to consider today is, how do we kill this giant of fleshly desire? How do we address it? How do we deal with it before it gets us? Our text this morning is going to be 2 Samuel chapter 11. And we're going to be looking just at the first 4 verses, 3.5 verses actually, of this chapter. Well, as we've been going through this series, you know, we've been covering a whole lot at each time. We've been covering sometimes 2, 3, and 4 chapters. We're actually going to look at 3.5 verses today and focus in on this giant that David faced. Let's start off by reading together 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 1 beginning. It says, "In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem." I'll stop there for just a moment and picture what's happening. This is the spring of the year, and this was the time when, and we have a hard time relating to this, but this was a time for them when it was a good season to fight, right? If they had military campaigns that they were going to do, the weather was good during this time of year. And so this was when the kings would lead their armies into battle to fight and to be engaged in the different military campaigns that they were going to do. And typically, David would be leading his men into battle. That's what he had done every time before. But this particular occasion, David decides to stay home and let his armies go out and do the fighting for him. Verse 2, it says, "It happened late one afternoon, when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful." So picture what's happening here. David's just kind of hanging out on the couch on his rooftop terrace there in his palace. He's hanging out, minding his own business, I guess. But then he decides to go over and look over the edge and look down into people's backyards, basically, or on their roofs. All right? It'd be kind of akin to if you and I decide to go walking in our neighborhoods in the evening and stop in front of each person's house and look in their bedroom windows. Right? That's basically what David is doing. He's looking into other people's private properties. And so he's looking and he sees there's a woman there on her rooftop and she is taking a bath. And he sees that she is a beautiful woman. Verse 3, "And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now there's more to this story, but I want us to focus in on this event right here, because here's David. David was a man after God's own heart, and yet in this situation, David completely missed God's heart. At this moment, David completely missed God's heart because he missed God's intent for sexual intimacy. He totally missed God's purpose for sexual intimacy. You see, sexual intimacy is a part of God's intent for us. God designed us to be able to have sexual intimacy. He made that for us, but he made it to be within a specific purpose, and God designed it to be within a specific relationship. And folks, I believe that it's time that the church takes back the narrative concerning sexual intimacy. We have allowed society to take over this narrative. We have allowed society to send messages about what it's about, and we have remained pretty silent on it. We don't talk about it very much. We don't teach on it. We don't preach about it very much. We just expect people to understand it. And here the world is telling us all these mixed messages about what sexual intimacy is about. We hear the message that sexual intimacy is to be had with anybody that you have connection with. Doesn't matter, different sex, same sex, none of that matters. Just if you have a connection with them, that's what it's for. Just to further that connection. We're told that sexual intimacy is something that you do to try out a relationship, to see if you need to marry the person. Check it out first. Test everything first. That's the kind of message that we're told from society, and yet it is directly contrary to God's message, is his intent for the intimate relationship. And so we have to recognize that as Christians and realize, Jesus spoke about this subject at least 4 times in Scripture. We are given a lot of information about what the expectations are, and it's time that we take back the narrative and make sure that everyone understands what God's intent for sexual intimacy is. And so this morning we want to look at this event, and there's several things we want to see. The first thing is we want to consider this question, because if David missed God's heart with this particular giant in his life, we need to be asking the question, what is God's heart concerning sexual intimacy? What is God's purpose? What is his desire for it? Well, the answer actually starts all the way back in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, God reveals his heart on this subject. And God says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Now, this is actually the first reference we have in Scripture to sexual intimacy in the Bible. That term, one flesh, literally is in reference to that joining together sexually. And what we have here is God revealing his heart, because there are 3 distinct aspects to God's design in this passage. The first thing that we see here is that it is exclusive. It is exclusive. He says a man shall leave the relationship he has with his parents, his father and mother, and join into a relationship with one person. A man with a woman with a man. You leave and you join. It is exclusive. It is not a relationship that is shared. It is exclusive between one man and one woman. The second thing we see here is that it is something we have within relationship. He says here to hold fast to his wife. In other words, join in relationship. Sexual intimacy is part of a relationship. It's not something that we just go and do for any reason. It's not something we do just to satisfy ourselves. It is part of the relationship that God has designed. It is exclusive. It is in relationship. And number 3, it is part of a covenant. He says, you shall become one flesh. In other words, God brings us together in a covenant relationship. I've mentioned this before, but I hear people say a lot of times that marriage is a contract. And yet, that's not what we see in Scripture. You know, contracts a lot of times have ending dates, beginning dates and ending dates. There are ways to get out of contracts. You know, you can make those contracts null and void, and you can move on. A covenant relationship is different because that covenant relationship is between these two people and God. And so it is exclusive, it is a relationship, and it is a covenant. And notice, if you read through this passage, God is a part of all of this. God, it is God's intent to be a part of this relationship. It's not just two people. God is a part of this union. God has designed this relationship of marriage to include Him as part of it. And so with God's intended context, within God's intended context, sexual intimacy is part of God's plan for us. The sexual intimacy outside of God's intent is described by a 3-letter word. It is sin. Sexual intimacy outside of God's definition is sin. That's why, you know, I don't see any need for us to get so caught up in this thing of, can a man be with a man, a woman be with a woman, can people live together, all this stuff? Folks, it's answered real simple. God designed the sexual relationship to be within the confines of marriage, and marriage is between one man and one woman. Amen. It's that simple. It's not complicated. And we don't need to muck it all up with all these different arguments and all these different debates about different things. Folks, it's that simple. God defined marriage. God defined what the role that sexual intimacy is to play within marriage. And it's time we take back that narrative and we recognize that God has a purpose for us. And so, with that in mind, we then have to ask the question, what led David to this point? What led David to this giant? Because we recognize that David was a man after God's own heart. David was a man who wanted to please God. He wanted to do God's will in his life. He focused on that in so many ways. All we have to do is read through the Psalms. And David wrote many of the Psalms. And we see David's heart and how he connected with his love for God. And yet, in this particular situation, David gives into a giant that leads him not only to the sin of adultery, but leads him to the sin of murder. How did David get to that point? Well, when we go back to 2 Samuel 11, verses 1 through 4, we see 3 key words, or 3 key points here. The word battle, the fact that David saw, and the fact that David inquired. Let's look at these. The first one is battle. And the question is this: where was David when his soldiers were fighting for him? Where was David? Every other time, David was where when his soldiers were in battle? With his soldiers. Every other time, David fought alongside them. Every other time, David was leading them in battle. This one time, David wasn't fighting. David had stopped fighting, and what happens when we stop fighting? We end up being where we're not supposed to be. When we stop fighting the battle, we start finding ourselves in places where we shouldn't be. And here is David. Instead of being on the battlefield, David is in a place where he shouldn't be, that is going to lead him to things that he shouldn't do. Have you ever heard the saying, idle hands are what? The devil's workshop, right? Well, here, David should have been working, and instead he had idle hands. David was bored. And so David was just kind of laying around, getting up, walking around, doing his thing because he wasn't where he was supposed to be. But then the second thing we see is that then David saw. David looked at something he shouldn't have looked at. It said, some translations say David beheld. Well, what did David behold? He was focusing his eyes somewhere he had no business looking. And one of Satan's greatest weapons that he uses against us is lust of the eyes. And that's why we see in our society today that we are inundated with that. Do you know that the food industry understands that very well, don't they? And so when they put on commercials for food, they give us the ugliest food they possibly can on those commercials, right? No. They dress that food up. They want it to look mouth-watering. They want it to look just like, oh man, I gotta have this. One of the commercials that gets me almost every single time is once a year when it's Red Lobster's Endless Shrimp. Right? And they put those pictures of that shrimp on there, and I'm just like, man, because that shrimp's one of my favorites, and they put those pictures. And if they just said on there, hey, we have endless shrimp, I wouldn't think a thing of it. But man, they put the pictures of those shrimp on there, and I just can't wait to get to Red Lobster and partake of that endless shrimp. Why? Because it's lust of the eyes. We live in a society now that has inundated us with things to lust after, both from a sexual standpoint and just from a desire standpoint. Do you know that right now it's estimated some 80% of the downloads, the picture downloads on the internet are of pornography? It is estimated that about 89% of our teenagers have been directly exposed to pornography on their social media. It is around us every single day. And it's gotten so bad that we have redefined what pornography is. Now, we've said, well, if a woman is topless, that's not really pornography. That's not. If we see a man's backside, that's not pornography. We've redefined it. Why? Because we are inundated with it to the point today that it is all around us. And that's how Satan works. Satan knows if he can just get you to behold it, then you're one step closer. But you see, David didn't stop with just looking where he shouldn't look and being where he shouldn't be. David took it even another step further because then David inquired about her. David said, "Who is this woman? Tell me about her." Now, why did David inquire? Because David wanted to open the door of opportunity. David wanted to open that door of opportunity. He could have shut it by being where he didn't want to be, where he shouldn't have been, Or he could have shut it after he looked where he shouldn't look. But David wanted to open that door even further, and so he inquired about her. Tell me about this woman. Now let me demonstrate or illustrate what this looks like from a practical standpoint. I've shared with you all before that I have been wanting a pickup truck. I live in Citrus County now. I should have a pickup truck. It's just an automatic thing. should have it. Matter of fact, it should be a thing that just when you become a citizen in Citrus County, they give you one. I just think that should be a thing. But I've been wanting a pickup truck, right? And I have been thinking, in my spare time, I spend a lot of time thinking about which kind of truck I want and whether or not it's really financially practical right now. And the answer is no, it's not. I spend a lot of time focusing on and thinking about a truck. And occasionally, I'll walk over to the balcony, in other words, get on the internet, and I'll look at pickup trucks. And I'll look at the different dealerships and what's out there right now, which isn't much, but I look. But you know what? Until the day comes that I go to a dealership and inquire about a specific truck, you know what I will never do? I will never buy a pickup truck. Until I actually go and inquire about a specific truck, I will never get a truck. I may talk about them, I may think about them, I may look at them on the internet. But until I actually go and inquire, I will never get one. And so guess what I have not done up to this point, and I've kept myself from doing? I haven't stepped foot on a dealership. Why? Because I know that's just one step away from making a decision I don't need to make right now. Now that's not a big deal whether I get a pickup truck or not. It's a big deal to me, but it's not really a big deal ultimately. But, I have been here 1 year if anybody wants to give me an anniversary gift for but the reality is when we deal with this issue of sexual intimacy and sexual sin, the best thing we can do is stop it at the door before we even begin to open it. But folks, stop it before you get to the point of inquiry. Don't let yourself get to that point. David got to the point of opening the door all the way, and now all he has to do is step through it. And so this is what led David to the point of this giant taking over his life. It is, number one, he wasn't where he should have been. He wasn't in the battle. Number two, he was looking at things he shouldn't behold. And number three, he was inquiring about things he needed to run away from. And so that leads us this morning to the final point, and that is, how does this apply to us? I believe that there are 4 lessons that we need to take away from this today. And the first one is this. If we want to defeat this giant, we need to stay on the path. We need to stay on the path. What was David's problem? David was getting off the path. David wasn't where he needed to be. He should have been in battle. He was stepping outside of God's plan. And folks, the moment we step out of God's plan, we are going to get ourselves into trouble. And so here, David is stepping outside of God's plan. He's getting off the path. And if we want to live free from sexual temptation, we've got to stay on the path. We've got to stay stay within God's plan. You see, I do not believe that it is that our sexual passions get too strong. Have you ever heard someone say regarding sexual sin, they say, well, I just couldn't help myself. The desire was just too great. I just couldn't overcome the desire that I was facing. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that it's possible for the sexual passions to become too strong. I think what it is that our passion for God becomes too weak. And when our passion becomes too weak, passion for God becomes too weak, something is going to fill that void. Something's going to take its place. And so the first thing we need to do is to stay on the path. The second thing we need to consider is to remember that it is not one giant step that gets us off the path. Usually it is a series of small steps that get us off of the path that we need to be on. Let's go back and look at verse 2 of 2 Samuel 11. It says, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Here we see David taking 4 steps that led him to this sin. The first step was David got off the couch. Step number 1. David got up. Seems innocent, right? Doesn't seem like that would be a big deal at all, but step 1 leads directly to step 2, and that is he began walking around on the roof, looking for something to do. But then that step number 2 led to step number 3, and that is that he looked where he had no place looking. You see, if he had stayed on the couch, he would have never found himself in a position to look where he should be looking. But because David was where he shouldn't be, he was doing what he shouldn't do, and that led to step 4, and that is he focused in on what he shouldn't. He focused in on something that he should have tried to stay away from. You see, we often think that temptation comes with neon lights. You know, that temptations come with saying, hey, you are being tempted. And Satan's up there saying, hey, this is me. I'm Satan. I'm tempting you. Here it is. Folks, that's not the way Satan works. You see, it usually is a series of small steps. You know, I've been a minister now for well over 30 years, and I've heard a lot of different things. And regarding this particular subject, these are just a few quotes that I've heard over the years. One that I've heard many times is, well, I never meant for it to go that far. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I didn't intend for it to ever to get to that point. Or I've heard people say, well, you know, I just needed somebody to talk to. You know, my wife or my husband, they just didn't listen to me anymore, and I just needed somebody to talk to. I just need somebody to hear me. And, you know, just one thing led to another thing. Or one that I've heard a number of times is, well, you know, we just started as friends, but then something happened, and then something else happened, and then something else happened. And what do each one of these quotes have in common? A series of small steps that led them away from the path. You see, it doesn't start where it's just blatant and obvious. It starts with a series of small steps. And we need to remember that as Christians, but that leads us to the third point, is that when we find ourselves veering off the path, the best thing we can do is to run away and run back to God. Run back to that path. Have you ever thought of how David's story would have changed if he had just run away? If David, instead of focusing in on this situation, had just run away. If David had said what Jesus said in the wilderness, and if he had just said, get behind me, Satan, I'm not going to be a part of this, and gotten back on the path, David's story would be very different. And the reality is that if we run from temptation, we will never reach the point of sin. Jesus describes it this way in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 27, Jesus says, You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. What does Jesus say here? Jesus says, if you can think it, you can do it. And so if you put the thoughts in your heart, those thoughts are going to lead you to action. And so what is the best thing we can do? Run away. Stay as far away from those thoughts as we possibly can. Do not even give ourselves the opportunity to get caught up in it in our lives. The Apostle Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18. He says, flee from sexual immorality. In other words, run away from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. What is Paul saying here? He says, what we do with this body that God has given us matters. And so when we find ourselves getting caught up in the possibility of sexual immorality, we need to run. We need to stay as far away from it as we possibly can. But what do we find ourselves doing? We find ourselves saying things like, well, I know my limits. I know what really is going to get me, and I know the things that really tempt me, and so I know I can do this, and this, and I may get close to that point, but I'm not going to get fully involved in sin here because I know where I can stop. Or we say, well, it's not just up to me, it's up to the other person, and I put my trust in that other person, and I know they're not going to let me get to the point that where we don't need to go. And folks, when we flirt with danger, we run the risk of being hurt. When we flirt with sin, we run the risk of giving ourselves over to it. The best thing we can do is run away and run back to God, which leads us to the final point this morning, and that is this. When we find ourselves off the path, recalculate your route. You see, what we find with David is he gave himself over to sexual sin. He committed adultery. That adultery then led him to trying to hide his sin. He killed Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. So he committed murder. He did all of these things. But what happened when David came to recognize his sinfulness? He recalculated his path and he came back to God. One of the things that I love about these little gadgets that we have, I know some of you don't like them. I love mine. It's kind of surgically attached, I think, somehow. But the thing that I love most about this is not the talking to people part. That part is not my favorite. My favorite is the GPS. And the fact that I don't have to ask anybody how to get to their house ever again. Right? All I have to do is say, give me your address, and I put it in here. But you know what happens when we do that? Is, we'll be going down the road, and for some reason we have to veer off the path. It might be because you want to get gas, or it might be because there's a car accident, or something, and you veer off the path. And you know what this little gadget will do? It will recalculate. It will come up with a different way to get you to where you want to go, to get you back on the path. And so even if I veer off, I know that little gadget is going to get me back where I need to go. Spiritually, we are going to find times in our lives when we get off the path. And there are some in this family here who have found ourselves, when it comes to sexual intimacy, in that position in our lives, where we've gotten caught up in something where we were in a place we didn't need to be. We were doing things we didn't need to do that led us a direction where we didn't need to go. But the good news is this morning is God says you can come back home. You can get back on the path. And one of my favorite events in the life of Jesus that really depicts this is found in John 8, verses 3 through 11. And this is where we're going to end today. We want to look at the events in John chapter 8, and then the lesson will be yours. Let's start in verse 3. It says, the scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say? So picture what's happening. The scribes and Pharisees come to Jesus. They bring a woman that they caught, and we don't know the details here, but somehow caught her in the very act of adultery. So there's no question what was taking place here. This wasn't a speculation. This wasn't gossip or rumor. She was caught in the very act. And they bring her to Jesus, and they say, Jesus, The scriptures, the law tells us that this woman should be stoned. That she should be killed for this act. What do you say? Verse 6. This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And they continued to ask him. He stood up and said to them, let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. These are one of the events in the life of Jesus that, man, I just wish I could have been there. I wish I could have seen this event take place. But here's Jesus. They are trying to trap him. They're trying to catch him on something. And so Jesus, he doesn't respond, by lashing out. He just kind of stops, bends down, starts writing in the sand, writing on the ground. And then he says, hey, guys, whichever one of you here who's never sinned, you grab the first stone and chunk it at. If any of you here are without sin, notice he didn't pinpoint sexual sin here. He didn't pinpoint adultery. He says, if there's any of you here who are without sin, you be the first one to chunk a stone at this woman. You be the first one to choose her fate. Verse 9. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, no one, Lord. And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. Notice what Jesus does here. When the people realize that there's no way they can catch Jesus in this argument, and they understand that there's no way they can be the first one to throw a stone, they leave, and they leave. It's just now Jesus and this woman. And just imagine the emotions that had to be going through this woman's heart at this time. She's just been embarrassed. She's been ridiculed. She's been called out. And now she is standing before Jesus. And Jesus simply says, has anybody condemned you? She says, no one. And Jesus says, I'm not here to condemn you either. You go on your way, but stop sinning. What was Jesus really telling this woman to do? He was saying, recalculate your path. You've gotten off the path. You have found yourself in a place where you don't need to be in your life. Get back to where you need to be. And the message this morning is not that we just need to forget the things that we've done. We need to acknowledge what we've done, and we need to acknowledge when we find ourselves off the path, whether it be sexual sin or any other sin in our lives. We need to acknowledge that we're off that path. We need to recalculate. And Jesus says to us, he does not want to condemn you. He wants to save you. That's his desire for you. He wants to save you. And so your call is to get back on the path. Stop that sin that you're involved in. Run away from it and get back on the path into that relationship with God. Just come home. As parents, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but are there any parents here who just couldn't wait to punish their children? Couldn't wait to, man, I get to spank my child today. How exciting. I get to punish my child today. Man, this is great. I just can't wait. No. What do we want to do for our children? We want to hug them. We want to love them. We want to play with them. We want to enjoy them. We want to nurture them. We don't want to condemn them. We don't want to punish them. Jesus says here, it is not my desire to bring condemnation. I want to love you. I want to nurture you. I want to be in relationship with you. And the message this morning is, if you find yourself caught up in sexual sin or any other sinfulness in your life, recalculate. and come back into that relationship. Don't let these things become giants in your life. Be like David. Recognize your sin and come home. If you're subject to the invitation, we invite you to come. And stand as we sing.